So, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Steve Brown, as you can see from the slide. I am a futurist. I probably should explain very briefly what that is, for those of you who don't know. It's not just a made-up bullshit term, it's a thing. What it is, I help companies figure out what the world will be like 5, 10, and 15 years from now, sometimes further. And so I do work on the future of retail, the future of manufacturing, and one of my favorite areas is the future of transportation, which is what we're here to talk about today. I think the best way to get us started is I'll just do a little intro, a few thoughts from a futurist's brain to set the tone of what's the broader context within which we'll be operating. Then we'll get the panel up here, and we're going to do free-flowing Q&A between them. I'll pose some questions. As that's happening, be thinking about what questions it brings up in your mind, because we're going to have then an open Q&A. We will be running a microphone around. For the reason for that, please don't just blurt out your question without a microphone in your hand, because we are capturing this on video, and we want to make sure we capture your voice. So when we get to that phase, be thinking about microphones. We'll do about an hour of panel discussion, maybe a little less, and then we'll shift to about half an hour of time with you, open Q&A, whatever you're interested in. So be thinking about what your question is, write it down so you don't lose it, make sure that we get your questions answered. And if you don't want to ask your question in front of your colleagues, you will have a private question, then save it for when you come in and sit down with the panelists. Find which table they're sat at, and then you get some more one-on-one time over a drink as well, which is always nice. So whenever I think about the future, I start by thinking about the past. And if we think about the evolution of the motor car, since they were invented in the late 19th century, we have seen huge breakthroughs and evolutions in the way that we move human beings around. And most of those have been related to some technology breakthrough, very often electronics related and compute-related breakthroughs. So electronic fuel injection, ABS, navigation, on-car diagnostics, hybrid engines, and most important, of course, is Bluetooth connectivity, because no one could live without that, right? So the next major leaps, as we look forward now, they're nearly all related to compute and connectivity. That's what will transform the way that human beings move around. And all of that is going to be driven by data. And you heard that from Mike. I concur. I mean, I think data is at the core of what is going to happen in this industry sector. The capture, storage, processing, and refinement of that data is what is, it's already given us Uber and Didi and Lyft. It's given us parking and lane assist, and it is what is going to give us full autonomy, which will change the way that human beings move around the planet. So there is huge industry activity in this area, and there are lots of ways you can measure sort of industry activity. One of them is the number of patents that are being generated. In the last 7 years, 5,839 patents have been granted for autonomous vehicle technology. So there's huge effort in this area. And the industry effort is really designed around revolutionizing human mobility, making mobility services more accessible, more enjoyable, and importantly, more safe. In the US alone, there's a road accident every 6 seconds. Almost 40,000 Americans lose their lives. About 1.25 million people globally are killed in car accidents every year. 94% of those are caused by humans. So if we can mitigate that, it's going to make a huge difference for people. And in the process of all that, by the way, $76 billion worth of property damage is done in the US alone by people driving their cars into things that they probably shouldn't. So to realize this vision for sort of a safer, better mobility, it all comes down to data. How you collect that data and how quickly you can collect and process that data. So what is this data we're talking about? Where is it coming from? Telemetry data from all the sensors in the engine, in the transmission, in the braking system of the car. In autonomous vehicles, there's this deluge of data which is coming. And I think car manufacturers are only just figuring out what they can do with this data. So at a baseline, it's data coming from multiple cameras, radar, LiDAR, ultrasonics. Once you're on the move, now if you want to do a journey of any length, you're downloading from the cloud precision maps so that you can navigate the environment, getting real-time updates on traffic and hazards, points of interest, information from other cars and infrastructure around you. So all of this data is flooding into the car. The only way you can handle that is to have the right storage that can handle it at the speeds that you need. So all of this happening many times a second at 70 miles an hour, and you're doing it to make critical life or death decisions. This is why an event is being hosted by Micron today. Because in order to make that happen, you're going to need the memory that is able to keep up with those challenges and to make those decisions in real time. In addition to that, you're going to start to see the car turn into the next major app platform. People are going to expect to be able to buy apps for their cars so that that space that they're occupying can be transformed to do whatever they want it to do, whether it's to play games, watch movies, or host a video conference, or something else. And to put this into context, in terms of how much data we're talking about here, the average turn-by-turn navigation application that you might use on your phone consumes about 5 megabytes of data in an hour to use those turn-by-turn navigations. If you're streaming a movie, an HD movie, you're looking at about 800 to 900 megabytes within that 1 hour. In a connected car, you can be looking at 25,000 megabytes in 1 hour. That's according to a study by McKinsey. So increasingly, the limitation on all this innovation is not just about the ability to compute. It's the ability to store and access all of this data at the speeds that you require. So Micron, I only found this out recently. I have to admit I did not know this. They are the leading supplier of memory to the automotive sector. Again, this is why Micron is hosting this today. And as you'll hear, they're really trying to drive this conversation on how do you handle all of this data as it moves into, out of, and around the car. So we have roughly 1.4 billion cars on the planet today. 1.4 billion. So the opportunity is huge. IHS projects that the autonomous car market will grow at a CAGR of 63% between 2020 and 2040. So in the 2035 timeframe, we could be looking at 21 million autonomous cars being built in that year. So there's lots of opportunity here. And to talk about that opportunity, I want to bring our panel up. So we could discuss this. Gentlemen, do you want to just come and grab your seats? Hopefully you all know which seat to put your butts into. These guys, this is an all-star industry panel. You have some of the smartest minds. I had the great pleasure to spend a bit of time over lunch talking to them to really help us think through what are the challenges of this nascent marketplace. How are we going to get that done? It's going to take many players working together. This is not something that will happen because of one company makes a real push. So let me introduce our panel to you. So you've seen enough of my face here. If I press the right button, that would work. So on my left here, my left, your right. Jeff Bader, he is the Vice President of the Embedded Business Unit at Micron. Next to him, Tim Wong, who is joining us from NVIDIA. Let's bring his thing up here. So Director of Technical Program Management for Autonomous Vehicles at NVIDIA. Next, Sanjay. Sanjay Vishin is the Director of Automotive Platforms at Qualcomm. To Sanjay's left, your right. The stage left, stage right thing is very weird to me. Doug Seven. Doug Seven is joining us from Microsoft. He's in the Azure team, but he's the Vice President. Oh, what happened there?
If only I were the Vice President.
The head of, yeah, we can promote
Thanks for the promotion, though.
Right there, right there. So he's the head of Azure IoT Mobility at Microsoft. And then, old friend of mine, Steve Pawlowski, he's the VP of Advanced Computing Solutions at Micron also. So please join me in welcoming our panel. So let's kick us off. This is a brand new market. We're still figuring out the connected car, the slide here, there we go. The connected car, the autonomous car. Putting this together is going to be quite a challenge. It's going to take every one of you working together to try and figure this out. And there are still a number of challenges that we're going to have to reach and figure out along the way. One of them is, where does the compute happen? what's architecturally, what does it look like? And Mike said, 5G is not going to solve this. It can't all happen in the cloud and have a remote device in the form of a car do all of the compute and all of the data handling. How do you see that evolving over time? Where does compute and where does all of this effort live? Is it in the cloud? Is it in the edge? Is it in the network? Is it a combination? How does that change over time?
Yes.
Yes.
I can be a little bit more specific. So where we see autonomous cars is, by definition, autonomy means it has to be on its own. So it cannot be. It has to be able to drive safely, be autonomous without a cloud connection. But what we see is similar to, you have apps on your phone that are like this. The experience gets better. You're connected to 4G, it gets a little bit better. 5G, it's even better. With a connection, you have access to detailed maps. You may have traffic light infrastructure data. It'll be a better experience. But by definition, if it is autonomous, it needs to be able to run. Just like if you go somewhere where you don't have a map, you don't have your phone doesn't work, you can still drive. You drive slower because you're not sure where you're going, but you're still able to operate the vehicle. We see the same thing for autonomous vehicles.
Anything to add?
Yeah,
Sanjay?
I kind of agree with that. But if I could break autonomy into two waves. The first wave is what Tim was referring to, is when most of the perception happens locally to the car, and then it's relying less on the cloud and the surrounding the environment around it. And as you move into the second wave of autonomous cars, then perhaps that's when we'll make bolder decisions in order to get remote sensors into the car around your surroundings. But like you said, for that, the connectivity system has to gear up to that. So presently, we're at 4G, 4.5G. As we go up to 5G, that's when, and get more spectrum, more bandwidth, then you can do this next wave of autonomy.
There's two sides or two perspectives, I should say, when you look at autonomous driving. There's sort of a reactive perspective of autonomous driving, where the car, to Tim's point, is making a lot of the decisions. It's reacting to what it sees and senses in the world around it, and that is very low latency. Immediate processing happens at the edge in the car. If you think of the car as an edge device, an intelligent edge device, happens there. There's also a proactive side to autonomous driving. When we as humans drive around, oftentimes we're driving in places we know and we understand. We know there's a pothole on the right side of that road because we drive it every day, so we kind of stay to the left a little bit. We know don't turn down that road on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock because there's a school bus stop and it's going to slow me down. And so there's this colloquial knowledge you have to driving, or information that you get from external sources, like listening to the radio and hearing about a traffic accident or weather. So there's this proactive side to autonomous driving that can't be fulfilled at the edge by itself. The edge is capable of the reactive part, and that's a very important part, and that's the part that's going to hit the brakes immediately when a kid runs in the street. But the proactive side is going to be fed by the cloud.
It's like tribal knowledge in the cloud, sort of thing?
Colloquial knowledge and real-time information. You mentioned real-time traffic and things like that, and there's more to it than just that. But there's also this, when you think about high-definition maps that will feed the car, those high-definition maps provide some of that colloquial data, knowing where there's potholes, knowing where there's obstacles on the road, things like that. So, ultimately, it's this combination of the reactive edge processing and the proactive cloud capability that comes together. So the processing really does have to happen everywhere, and each of these sides of the equation have to work in concert with each other.
But even for the phase one, as you called it, you're still doing training in the cloud. To come up with these models to detect pedestrians, detect animals, detect other cars, you're doing all that training in the cloud on a very big data center. So you're still using the cloud even for phase one.
Yeah. We're working with customers that even want to do training out at the edge. So it's not just going to be relegated to the cloud. I'd probably a little more pragmatic. It all depends on the energy you have available to do whatever you're doing at the edge. That's going to be a big portion of it. Mike is right. The tragedy of commons will never go away. Okay, there will always be, you'll have a limited resource and it will constantly be exploited and overexploited. I think that the bottom line is there will be enough compute and capability inside the vehicle to live with the energy constraints that you have. I remember a story a friend told me years ago. He was consulting for a car company, and they brought him in because he was an expert on triple mode redundancy, because they wanted to make sure that as they're adding more compute to the car was safe and reliable. And so he was asking him about the different aspects of the car, and they said, well, we use that because we want to be able to, when the car is at the high RPM, we want it to be able to run reliably. And he said, well, I know that takes margin. What do you do? Well, we're out of margin. So what do? You turn off the very thing that you put into the car in order to save people, and it's all a matter of energy and timing. So that's really going to dictate a lot of what I think is going to happen. And people will put more energy and more capability in, but that will still be a limiting factor.
And quite a few of us here came from the PC industry of old. And I was just doing some research online, and it feels like the autonomous vehicle industry is kind of like the PC industry was in about 1995. Because I looked it up. In 1995, to buy a Pentium 2, 266 machine with not very much memory and running Windows 95, it cost you $4,000 to buy one. So the electronics was $4,000. If you inflation adjust that, it's close to $6,000. If you think about the budget for electronics in an autonomous car, at that time the PC sector was about 100 million units. Cars is about 90 million units now. So it feels like the industry is somewhat similar, and it was also very constrained on the number of transistors you could put in there and the energy you could put into it. So it feels like you've got a 30-year run ahead of you in autonomous as we get more and more sophisticated in the way we do the applications. As you look forward, what are the challenges that you see to this kind of sustained increase in sophistication of autonomous driving? There's the baseline of, we'll get to level 5, but there are so many more layers you'll be able to put onto that over time.
I think you run into an immediate problem that you're dealing with an industry that has a lot of legacy. Here's an industry over 100 years old, used to making metal contraptions, who now have to think about the fact that they're making computers. It just so happens their computers have wheels and move around. And some of the more enlightened automotive makers that I talk to think of them as data centers on wheels. They're not even thinking about it as a single computer anymore. They're thinking about it as a networked device that's moving around. And so there's a maturity aspect in the automotive industry for them to make that transformation and to kind of mentally shift from being manufacturers and makers of a mechanical device to being software companies and companies making technology and putting that technology into a computer.
The pace of technology is clearly accelerating. It has to, in order to do what we're asking these cars to go do, right? Mm-hmm. You can go back and you look, the first navigation systems were based on a DDR2 technology that was proven 5 to 7 years beforehand in PCs before it was adopted in the car. Today, we're shipping LPDDR4 technology, latest and greatest process, 9 months after Mike's shipped it into a mobile application, right? So that speed of adapting technology is one of the responses to what you're saying. We're at the beginning of that transformation of the automobile, or the next transformation of the automobile, let's say, right?
So when you think about we talked a little bit about some of the sources of data. There's the telemetry stuff. There's the sensors in an autonomous vehicle. What are the sources of data that maybe people aren't thinking about, and not necessarily in the short term, but in the medium term? What are the sources of data that will have to be handled by the autonomous car of the future, or the connected car of the future?
Well, I was just saying, I think there's an event tomorrow, maybe it's going to probably talk about 10 years worth of cell phones, smartphones, right? And you think about how that industry has changed, and think about so many industries that have built up around the smartphone, right? The exact same thing will happen when we get to autonomous cars. There will be services. You will have Netflix for the car, right? You will have apps, as you said. There's all that is another source of data that has to be stored, processed, pulled down from the cloud, run over somebody's network, et cetera, right? So I think what you'll see as you get to critical mass on autonomous vehicles is that set of services that are going to develop and businesses that are going to develop around them.
So what I was going to say is that, yes, you have a plethora of sensors in the car, LiDARs, radars, ultrasonic cameras. It's impossible to upload that all to the cloud. You're talking, gigabytes of
I would
data.
love it if you did.
Yeah, exactly. But what you're going to do instead is it's metadata, it's the occupancy grid, it's tracking objects. But where it gets interesting is if you are connected and you have a high bandwidth connection, your sensors, the other cars on the road are now your additional sensors. So as a car hits black ice, and it understands that it's on black ice, it lets all the cars know around it, they start moving out of the way. But basically, that's the metadata that you're sending up, and then it comes down to processed in real time. rather than actually sending raw sensor data.
Well, this is why the intelligent edge is so important. I'm the cloud guy, but we equally think about the edge as being a critical part of the solutions that we build. This is a great example. If you take autonomous cars with LiDARs and ultrasonic sensors and computer vision, and you're talking about petabytes of data a day that they're capable of ingesting, and there's no way, even with the 5G connection, we're not going to get that up to the cloud. And so we have to have this intelligence in the car to make decisions about what data is important and what data is not important, and what data can be flushed away because we don't need it, what data should be persisted and maybe uploaded at a more convenient time versus what's real time. And so this decision making at the edge of evaluating data and making choice around that data is not simple arithmetic. We're going to bring artificial intelligence into the car to do this decision making and make these cars much more capable than they are today, and ultimately filter through all that data to decide what to do with it.
I tend to agree. I think that cars there'll be huge ad hoc networks where different cars, depending on the proximity, will be entering into the network and sharing information. And the real question is do you want to let a bad actor in? So there's a lot of information you're going to have to take into is who's good, who's not good, how do you establish that? And be able to manage it accordingly. And then if a car happens to drop off and you use a link, how do you reestablish a different network?
But some of the data is agnostic. Like, we saw this scenario for real that you had a truck at a stoplight, it turned green, but the truck didn't go. And so the person who was coming up alongside it was going, but because there was a pedestrian in front of the truck. The car coming couldn't see it. But we actually had the communication working, so basically it knew to stop, even though they couldn't see why it stopped. But when he stopped, then the pedestrian came across and it made sense. So there's definitely object agnostic data that is helpful to essentially keep everyone safe, that I think will be shared.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the second wave of autonomy is when you're sharing non-line of sight sensors. So today all the sensors are all line of sight sensors, right. The radars and LiDARs and the cameras. So the non-line of sight sensors can get you, but for that, as I mentioned, the communication system gets hit by latency. Very low latency because you have to align what every car sees to your car, and then in time and in position. So any error in position, any error in time gets magnified in the filter. So it results in noise in the filter when you try to drive that car. So
to take this in a little different way, and I think it really comes down to what Mike was talking about. When you look at general purpose or even high performance computing, it takes roughly about 1,000 times more energy to move a bit of data around than it does to actually compute on that data. Mm-hmm. So we talk about, it's all about compute and communication. It's really about where's the data, what can you do with the data fairly closely, because that's where you're going to be spending, that's where your greatest latencies are, that's where your, and that's where your greatest amount of energy usage is going to be. And so, I look at it as, and this is, I spent 32, as you well know, I spent the first 32 years of my career at Intel, and I was focusing on the computing side, just like you were. And it became obvious that no, it really is, there's going to have to be somewhat of a change. And so I see where the automobile, this is why the memory and storage component is getting more and more important, is because computing is going to start moving closer and closer. And it's what can you do with that technology and inside that technology at that time and enable some of the different usage models that these gentlemen are talking about.
Let's dig back into the 5G thing again for a minute. Because Mike talked about this and said, 5G is not going to solve everything. How do things change between, people are trying to do autonomy today with 4G, 4.5G versus 5G. How do things change, if anything, in the approach that you have to build an autonomous solution with 4.5G versus 5G? And as an illustration of the fact that 5G is not some magical solution that will suddenly make autonomy in the cloud, driven by the cloud, possible. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because you talked about it at lunch. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, so we just finished building a first box for an autonomous car. So, and there's no 5G modem in there, obviously, because 5G hasn't happened yet. So I'll try to abstract it out so I don't reveal too much, but in this case we used multiple modems, 2, 3, 4 modems, depending on which OEM it depends how many modems they want to use. We go over multiple operators, so each modem, one is on AT&T, one on T-Mobile, one is on Verizon. So the same packet is sprayed across 3 networks just to make sure that if the car is in Phoenix or Arizona, wherever it is, you never hit a dead spot, even though you do these war drivings before. So we kind of conquered this reliable 5G thing with the 4.5G modem by using multiple modems. For security, typically we just encrypted everything into a VPN tunnel, aggregated over multiple modems, so the VPN doesn't really see. Everything is hidden, and so the 3 links are, the modems are below the VPN. We also have Wi-Fi, so it's not just cellular, right? So there's also Wi-Fi. As you said, there's a lot of sensor data these cars have, and they wanted to upload all the sensor data very quickly, but they're not going to pay for all that cellular bandwidth. So the cars, luckily in this case, tend to be more fleet cars, so that they have a garage to go back to, and the moment they get back near the garage, it's kind of similar to 5G, because in 5G you'll have spotty coverage of very high bandwidth coverage for millimeter wave. And so when you drive through that, perhaps the cloud can guide you towards a route which is going through these high bandwidth pods. Similarly, so we put in like 2x2, 4x4 Wi-Fi modems in there. So the sensor data doesn't typically go over the cellular network. Also, there is failure of local perception failure, because if you're in inclement weather and there is a policewoman diverting traffic in the middle of the street, right? These local perception mechanisms fail at that point, because it's very difficult to figure out gestures in a couple of pixels down in the camera. So in that case, they would resort to remote driving the car. So all the cameras are turned on, the 8 cameras are getting uploaded. So now you see a very different characteristic of data, in the sense that typically we've been used to the entertainment bandwidth, where you're downloading stuff and there's hardly any uplink bandwidth. But in this use case, you saw a huge amount of uplink bandwidth, because all the cameras have to go up to the remote operator within a certain amount of time, because the operator is actually seeing what's happening at that intersection and remotely driving the car. So these are some of the things which you don't really have to wait for 5G to come by. We can solve them this way.
So do we need 5G?
Well, you do need 5G, because 5G gives you much, as we were discussing. You can, with this, you're still doing local perception. You are not doing line of sight perception, right? Because there is, as you mentioned, there is a truck in between and there is a car behind the truck. There's no way your sensors are going to tell you that. So either you do what he was saying, that you somehow get the cloud to give you the electronic horizon around your car, an HD map around your car, or you rely on this high bandwidth 5G network to give you very low latency connectivity.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything else about sort of 5G, how it might change the dynamic, or is it really, from your perspectives, not change the way that the architecture should be built from 4 to 5?
I can't get a signal on my cell phone in my daughter's school in a suburban area. So I don't think just a bigger pipe is going to solve the problem, right? Because we're still going to, like, this is the thing, is like, no matter what we do, we're still going to have areas where there's not coverage. We're going to have cars that go places where coverage is disrupted for some reason. There's all kinds of reasons why, even if we have great 5G signal broadly available, it's not going to be 100%. And so we have to make the assumption that at any point in time, the 5G signal will go away, and we have to be able to respond to that event.
Yeah, but I just want to make it that you're focusing on the link for the 5G from the car to the cloud, right? Luckily, in cars, you care about the perception around your car.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary that for some functions 5G will still work. Agreed that for the connectivity to the cloud, that bandwidth will vary.
Yeah, but this is why the thin client model will never work for automobiles. You won't have full connectivity all the time.
Right.
Yeah, to the cloud. Yeah.
It feels like for the foreseeable future, an auto manufacturer who had an unlimited budget would choose to put way, way more compute and way, way more memory and storage in their cars if it was economically viable and didn't fill up the whole trunk or something. But for a long time, the compute system of the car is going to be massively stressed with all of the applications that are being dreamt up to make the car safer and to be able to operate in difficult environments. feels like there's a good runway here for all of you, your companies, to sell a lot of great product. How long do you, if you had a guess, do you have a feel for how long that heavy stress on the compute infrastructure goes on for?
I think forever. I think it's like a gas law.
That's my guess too, by the way.
Basically, you're going to expand to fill the container. So we've seen this. When we released our first autonomous car computer, people immediately started putting multiple of them in the car. So we announced another one that was way more powerful. People still are putting multiple of them in the car. So the next gen is going to be even more powerful, but it's an arms race, and it's going to continue.
You're saying they want to turn it up to 11.
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
time.
And it's continuous. As fast as we can build them, they figure out even bigger apps and more complex things they want to do with it.
I mean, that's why
And of course, you need fast memory.
Well, I was just going to say, that's why we announced what we announced today, which is, and announce, a nice box up on the right says something else that we haven't invented yet. Because the reality is this workload, from our view, right, it will be unmet unless we go figure out something beyond what we just talked about with GDDR6.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree, but you have to look at the application, right? If you're just running spreadsheets today, right, we would have met that would have been done. But in graphics, obviously, we haven't met that. So it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. And in autonomy, like you said, deep learning is still at a rudimentary stage, and we're not doing collaborative learning. So for the next 10 years, I think.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. Steve, you used the term bad actor, and this idea of, with cars are talking to each other V2V, you might have someone that's deliberately telling the other cars about hazards that don't exist, or is giving them information that's bad.
Exist.
Yeah, exactly. So the broader question, if we're turning every car into a potentially remotely guided 1-ton missile, how do you keep these things safe? What are the measures that need to be taken and are being taken to ensure that people can have confidence being in an automotive that's autonomous and safe? I know we've got a security expert back there, but from you, gentlemen.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think like your computer systems, like all systems, it's a defense in-depth strategy, right? That starts at some root of trust, and you have to build the entire system out from there, practically from there to the cloud, right? That says, I'm aware and can tell what the heck is in this chain from here all the way to the cloud, right? And any time that gets broken or gets interrupted, you have fail-safe mechanisms to sort of prevent that, right? I mean, it is fundamentally just right, a security application, right? I think that's where Steve was talking about triple mode redundancy. I think that there's a degree as well of some of the redundancy that's being built into these systems that will also help, right? I mean, you may find a hack that gets its way into one system, and you can sort of compare and sort of monitor that out, right?
Yeah, I think, quite honestly, I think it's an opportunity for the automobile to get it right, where I think the computing industry didn't. We're still building systems that, based on architectures that were conceived 30 years ago. And then we never anticipated people would use them for viruses and things like that. And so, as well as I do, we've spent the last several years just sticking our fingers in holes and trying to patch up old architectures, but it's difficult to change them because there's billions and billions of dollars of software out there that people will still be able to run. The automobile is a platform where you can actually start, if it's not too late, where you can start actually looking at, I'm not a fan of putting keys in a central location, and the Equifax hack is just yet another example, where a car is a very distributed environment, and so you can maintain your credentials and whatnot in a very distributed manner and basically, solve that part of the problem. But you still have the problem where somebody can come by and hack into your car over Bluetooth. Very insecure network. Those are the kinds of things that people need to think about now and get their hands around, because otherwise we're going to have literally another 100 million attack points. And that's also the IoT. IoT's got the same issue. Right?
Well, I think defense in depth is the right phrase to think about this, right? Because you have to protect the physical object, you have to protect the connection between the object and the cloud, and you have to protect the cloud. And in this, things like identity and authentication, authorization of the physical thing become critically important. That's probably one of most interesting attack vectors for someone is to get this bad actor model working. And so, going back to April when we announced some of the work we're doing between Azure and Micron around identity and identity management for connected things, and now with this security at the memory level, we're starting to build, and we just announced recently a device provisioning service where now you start to build this identity mechanism for creating better trust between the physical object and the cloud, and better reliability of that trust vector between those two.
Sorry, back to you.
I just like to separate out the two things because he's talking about safety and he was talking about security. There are two kind of slightly separate separate angles to building an autonomous car and the whole connectivity. So safety, like Steve said, typically most of them are using redundancy to solve that issue. And the problem with that is cost. I mean, putting TMR or DMR is, blows up your cost. So how do you do it cost effectively is the big issue, given the fact that the volumes in automotive aren't that high. So you have to kind of build it out of components which come from, for in our case, from the mobile world. So that's one issue with safety. In security, I think you guys have gone over it.
So there are a lot of things that people, it's sort of in the open conversation about the future of autonomy and cars, challenges we have to solve. You have a front row seat in this whole industry, and you're thinking about all of these things. What are some things that have occurred to you that you think, well, people aren't thinking about this yet, but they need to? What are some sort of forward-looking challenges? And you probably spend all day thinking about this sort of stuff, so let's start with you. But
I was hoping you'd start at the end and work
and then
this way.
give you time. Yeah.
I'm happy to start. So to me, and it's a personal thing for me, is get the stupid human drivers off the road. And I say that because I just got into a car accident. A lady decided to do a high-speed left turn in front of a wall of cars, and I was the lead wall of cars, 3 cars, and head-on collision. Completely unnecessary. I broke my collarbone. I still can't feel my leg. I'm healing. It only happened 2 months ago. But the point is that an autonomous car would have understood there's cross traffic. You will not make it, and it would prevent the person from doing that. The unpredictability of human drivers. I see it. I have a 45-mile commute to work. I see people doing crazy things all the time. Once you have enough autonomous vehicles, the humans are the danger. And to me, that's getting to autonomy faster, getting the humans off the road is going to be a better world.
To be clear, it's not once you get to autonomy, the humans are already the danger.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I do think there's a danger that we, from a mobility and transportation standpoint, have to think about. But there's a danger when you start mixing autonomous vehicles and human-driven vehicles together because of the unpredictable nature. Drivers who are distracted and doing dumb things, and similarly, I on my commute to work, I probably see once a week an accident, car off the side of the road, in a ditch, flipped over, something like that, because of the nature of the road and the nature and the behavior of the drivers on the road, because humans are inherently dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's also there's an adoption hurdle or barrier that we'll have to get through as well, right? I mean, I bet you could argue that a lot of people in this room might tend toward the early adopter side of the population, right? But the best target audience for me is my mom, who can drive in the 4 hours around noon when it's bright enough that she can see right now, right? And so it's not quite that bad. But the point is, the things that enables.
Where does she live? So
she's in Florida, so I don't think there's anything she needs to worry about, right?
She's got something to worry about.
Aren't you moving to Florida?
Yeah, not anymore. Yeah.
So I think that, but I don't think she's going to be the first one to go out and buy an autonomous driving car, right? And so I think we were talking about some of the personalization aspects of the algorithms on, if you personally don't like to drive next to a car or next to a big old truck, you're going to want your autonomous car to also not drive by that truck, even if it's better at it than you, right? And at least in the early phases of that adoption, right? So there's sort of that personalization angle that I think also has to be worked as the OEMs sort of build out those algorithms.
Or get rid of all the windows in autonomous cars.
But I'm actually going to disagree with you. So my mom is 91. She still drives. She only drives during the day and not when it's raining. And she sadly made my 16-year-old daughter, with just a permit, drive her somewhere because they went out to dinner, and then my daughter had never driven her car before, and she goes, I can't drive. And my daughter's like, well, I haven't driven your car. And so it made my daughter very uncomfortable. But the point is that with an autonomous car, she has mobility again.
Right.
You know, she can go to the store anytime. Right now, she relies on my wife, me, or my daughter for rides, and it's cumbersome because we all have a schedule.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it actually.
No, I think it's the
gonna help.
perfect audience.
Well, yeah, but
I
there's
just think there's
also
an adoption hurdle.
there,
there,
but
right?
there's the thing we're not addressing here. We're kind of making this huge leap forward to a world where everybody trusts autonomous cars, right? There's a credibility factor that has to be figured out in between here and there.
Yes.
Like, you know, I won't ask for a show of hands in the room, but the number of people who would be likely to go outside and get in the car with no driver, no steering wheel, no brakes, and have it take you to the airport is probably pretty low right now, because I can't even get the Bluetooth in my car to work reliably, right? And so there's this credibility factor that we have to work our way through, and it doesn't, we're not going to get there by saying, hey, look, we've got a fully autonomous car and it just works, trust me. But there's a lead up to it with technology that we'll put into cars over time that will build credibility and build trust.
And we're actually seeing some of that. That there are car makers, and I can't tell you who are looking at putting what we call it the occupancy grid, but it's basically everything surrounding the car that's been detected in your dash display. So it mirrors what you see outside. So even in bad weather, it's still showing you where all the cars are, as well as it's like a safety net. So if someone's about to blow a red light and you haven't seen them, it'll actually stop you from pushing the gas pedal. It won't let you bring yourself into harm's way. So I see a lot of these safety systems being rolled out ahead of autonomous cars to build trust.
Exactly.
You know, and if it saves you enough time, you start to trust it.
Yeah, I think the reverse is also true. I see user interfaces outside the car, so that if you're crossing, there's a smiley face in the car. You know, the car is it knows that I'm here, and we can trust him.
Hey, so I think that number one, your point about would you trust an autonomous car? My other question is, do you trust somebody whose brain averages 25 watts to do the computation there, who's had a really bad day, but we don't have a choice. We get in the car and then we or you get in an airplane and you pray to God and you hopefully you get there back. I think the interesting thing is with all the technology that's being put in for, you know, AI and classification, is when do they get to the point where these machines actually have the ability to think? Think in the sense of you're in a particular situation, identify the best traffic, you know, the best opportunity, what's happening inside the car, and be able to adjust the route or do the things that are necessary in order to optimize fuel and things like that. And the capabilities are there. The algorithms are starting to get there, and I think that that's going to be an interesting thing of how much they evolve. And then we'll get to the classic question, you know, are they thinking too much and will they take over society? But we'll worry about that later. That's your job. You're a futurist. So.
Well, yeah, and at Microsoft, we have a huge belief in the future of artificial intelligence and what it's going to mean for not just the transportation world, but everywhere, and where AI will be prevalent. And we sort of look at the world and the technology evolution as kind of like the diagram that was being shown earlier on the evolution of computing, where the cloud enabled a lot of things, and then as soon as you start thinking about IoT being enabled by the cloud and opening up a lot of capability, and then all of a sudden intelligent edge becomes the next important sort of wave in all of that, and you start moving more compute to the edge and start taking some of those cloud workloads and putting them in the edge. And the next evolution after that is artificial intelligence, and how do you really make the most out of not just compute at the edge, but bringing intelligence to the edge, where it is not just responding to actions, but thinking, processing, making decisions, and doing things. And that's the only way we're going to get to truly autonomous cars, because there is such a dynamic nature to traffic and people that it needs to be true thinking and intelligence.
So when you think about AI and where AI and machine learning is going, what are the opportunities, what are the use cases where you see AI in the short, medium, and long term playing in the future of the autonomous vehicle?
I think it's everywhere, whether you're talking pedestrian detection, whether you're talking about a driver-facing camera that knows where you're looking, so it knows where you're not looking.
I'm saying beyond machine vision, where would you see AI play? And
conversational, so communications, because you have, Alexa, Google Home, Siri, so natural language understanding, conversational understanding, and Cortana, as well as even lip reading. Those are all, if you're communicating in a car, there needs to be a highly reliable two-way communication. Yeah. And right now I would say it's not. My kids like to say random things just to see what the car does. It's a game, and it actually works really well. It's actually pretty funny sometimes. So getting that communication, so that's a huge area for AI, of understanding that. The sensor fusion, we're seeing sensor fusion being done in AI. where taking LiDAR, radar, camera, ultrasonics, putting it on the same grid, on the same scale. You can actually do it very quickly with AI. So you're seeing a lot of non-visual AI implementations.
Well, it's bringing these cognitive services to the edge, right? It's whether it's speech and language or computer vision. There's in all of these things. There's some input that's happening. There's some intent that's being created out of that, and there's some routing and action that has to occur. That in its simplest form, it's a trained machine learning model where it's doing some object recognition, and then you advance that to where it's starting to do localization for what's around it, and then you advance that to where it's starting to do motion prediction, and then you advance it to where it's starting to do path planning, and so it's this constant evolution of the AI. But it starts with these simple machine learning things where we've kind of explored them and we know a lot more about them, and we can do a lot of that today. But yeah, whatever cognitive capability it is you're trying to bring into the car, speech will be a great one. As we see the evolution of speech in a car, and more regulation comes down around things like distracted driving, where there's a higher dependency on not just a voice command to a car, but an interaction, and that the car can understand my intent when I ask a question, and that there's a continuous thread through a conversational flow that I can refer back to. When we're talking, and I can ask you, about this conference and what we're doing here, and I can refer back to it as it, and you know what I mean. That conversational flow has to be supported through AI.
I'll take even a simpler use case. When I ask for the nearest coffee shop, I'd like it to be on the route I'm already on, as opposed to the one that's behind me. Right?
But
Well, the nearest exit could be behind you, right?
Yeah. Not the closest one, the best one. That's what you want.
So with AI, it sounds like there's applications throughout, and as a futurist, I think about all sorts that might be coming. What does that do to the memory subsystem? If we move to where the silicon becomes accelerated for conducting AI functions, what kind of load does that put on the memory subsystems of the future?
More is better. I mean, it's that simple, because you've got, when you're doing inference, propagating, whether it's an image or an audio file or whatever through a network, you need fast memory. I mean, it's
more of it.
Yeah, and more of it. I'm going to do multiple things. The car's not just doing one network. There's many networks running in the car in parallel. So,
yeah, there's this great paper by NVIDIA and the University of Texas it's actually a paper on virtual distributed neural nets, but it actually shows the rate at which the memory requirements are growing just for doing just simple image recognition. But the feature maps are getting more complex. You mentioned, hey, 2 pixels, you can't detect which one did you mention? With 2 pixels, you can't detect a gesture or something like that. So the pixelization is getting higher, the feature maps are getting higher, and the growth in memory requirements is not linear, it's exponential. And so now you come to, okay, I've got this data, what do I keep, what do I get rid of? What's important, what isn't important? There's probably if there's a collision and somebody wants to go back and do forensics, you got, but the amount of data that's growing is extreme. And so now I think we're having to cull, and at some point in time, are you getting rid of good information that you shouldn't be getting rid of today? Right. As an analogy, we spent a lot of time with CERN. They found the Higgs boson, and now they're looking for now they're looking for dark matter. Okay. And one of the questions, and that's why they're starting to use AI and machine learning, at their edge, is because they're worried about what science are we losing because we're not looking for something that we should be. And so I think that's, and that all is driving an extreme need for greater amounts of memory, not only bandwidth, but capacity. The capacity drive is going to be huge going forward.
Which is good news if you're in the memory business, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's going to have to be reliable. I mean, it's going to be something that it's there, and if you happen to be at 125 degrees C, it's still as reliable as it is down at freezing. So
that's a part which I think we haven't touched on, is that I'm hoping deep learning will help us with reliability as well, not just learning, in the sense that if something breaks, right, can we work around that instead of having this older TMR redundancy crap like that? So that'll give us more efficient machines to build.
Actually, I thought it was a pretty sexy solution. That hurt.
Sell you 3 times the memory. I think it's a perfect solution.
Right.